Hi, my name is Rudy Rubio, and my work number is 1719. I started longshoring in 1955. We were raised in Wilmington, California, in Dana Strand Housing Project, and we moved to San Pedro. And I began junior high school, which is Dana Junior High here in San Pedro, in the 8th grade. I graduated from San Pedro High School in 1955. I went to Harbor College for a while, and I began longshoring in '55. I began working on the waterfront. In those days, they didn't have a casual hall, but in I think it was in Torrance, California, which is now Carson. They had a big baseball diamond there that was no longer being used. Originally, it was used by the Seattle Rainiers for their AAA club, and the union started dispatching extra longshore work out of that casual hall, which is a baseball diamond there, and that was in 1955. And then shortly thereafter, I was able to get my ID, and I began on the docks working as a longshoreman, as an ID, and then I was very fortunate because they elevated us from Class B to Class A within months, and so sometimes a person would work as an ID for 6, 7, 8 years before they got registered as a regular longshoreman. And what happened was the employers wanted to hire 500 new longshoremen, and the union didn't want to hire that many, so they negotiated half of that, 250, and then if it works out fine, then they'll grab the other 250. I was fortunate and got my ID with the first group of 250, and so they called us 90-day wonders because we got our IDs in I believe it was in August. I'm not sure the month, but within 3 months or so, they elevated us to Class A because the employer wanted more B-men, and so the union negotiated that before they agreed to take more B-men, they'd have to elevate those of us that were already B-men. So they called us 90-day wonders. It was actually 4 months that we ID'd before we got our books, so that the employer could have their second group of IDs. Okay, when I first started, the job that none of us really liked because it was difficult was bananas. The banana boats would come in, and in those days, the bananas were the big stalks of bananas that weighed maybe 100, 150 pounds, and you'd double up on them, and you'd put it on your shoulders. The bananas would come in boxcars, or no, they'd come in a ship. We'd unload the bananas off the ship with the big stalks, and then they'd have a conveyor belt that took the bananas from the ship across the dock, and then we were working on the dock, and we'd have two people, one on each, grab the front of the stalk and the other one the back, and you'd pick it up and put it on the shoulders of the guys that were waiting to take the bananas into the boxcars. So bananas was one of the first jobs. That was probably the only jobs that we were able to get when we first started, was because of the bananas. And then we'd take the bananas and we'd load them into the boxcars, and then from there the boxcars would go. The bananas were being loaded, in those days it was berth 147, which was in Wilmington, California, off of Neptune Street. And later on, the bananas started coming into Long Beach in addition to the ones that came in here. And that was the start of my working. And my father was a longshoreman before me. My father's name was Lewis, and my brother followed him, and his name was Lewis. And I was the baby, and my name is Rodolfo, but everybody called me Rudy. And I can recall when I came home from school, kindergarten, my first day of school in Wilmington, Hawaiian Avenue, I came home from school and I was crying, and my mother asked me how come I was crying, and I said, well, my name is Rodolfo, and they called me Rudy. And as it was, it stuck. So people still know that Rodolfo is Rudy, but everybody calls me Rudy. From there, I was my first. I started running for office, and I ran for the office of dispatcher. In those days, we would physically, there was 7 dispatchers, and you had the dispatch hall in Wilmington, and you had windows. And dispatchers were, maybe 3 feet above the men that were out on the floor waiting for their jobs. And you had 4 or 5 windows, and the one window would dispatch the whole jobs. The next window would dispatch the winch jobs. The next window would dispatch the jitney, called them jitney jobs, which was forklifts at the time. And then the last job was a dock window. And so I became a dispatcher, and we would physically, in the morning, we would get into the hall at 6 in the morning, and everybody would check in their numbers with their hours. You accumulated hours, and that was the hours you were on, because you were dispatched according to the low man out system. So the man with the least hours would get out first, ahead of the people with the higher hours. And that was the dispatch hall in Wilmington. The first hall was in San Pedro, down on Beacon Street. That was the first longshore hall, was in San Pedro. And then it went to Wilmington, and that's where I became a dispatcher. From there, I then ran for the office of Secretary of the Union, and I was elected as secretary and worked. In those days, we had rules that if you ran for office, you were elected for a year, and then you could seek re-election or seek a different office. And if you made it, you put in your second year, and after 2 years in office, you had to get out of office for 2 years. For 2 years, and when you were out of office, you went back in the hall and worked as a longshoreman, driving winch or driving forklift or working in the hole. And then after your 2 years were up, then you could run for office again. But it was a 2-year rule, we called it. So my next time for my first 2 years as a dispatcher, I came back to work in the hall. And then after the 2 years were up, I ran for Secretary of the Union, and I got elected to Secretary of the Union. And I replaced the guy that had been every 2 years was a secretary. His name was Jack Godfrey. Godfreys were, I think they lived in Lomita, I'm not sure, but there was quite a few Godfreys that were in the Union. And then from the 2 years there, I then went back to work after 2 years as secretary, and I came back and I ran for the presidency and got elected. Incidentally, the Local 13, I think at that time was probably about 70% Hispanic. Yet when I got elected as president of the union, I was the first Hispanic to get elected to the presidency of the office of the Longshore Union, and so it was. My dad was proud of that, that I was the first Mexican to get. And after that, Art Almeida, I think, followed me, and there was then everybody, it was. Well, to be honest with you, I don't think there was any. I don't think any Negroes got elected to union officers until sometime after that. I'm not quite sure on that, but it was a while before they started electing. And after that, it just filled in, and it didn't matter what you were, you got elected according to your popularity, I guess it was. And that's how I began working as an officer of the local. In 1937, the ILWU, International Longshore Warehouse Union, under Harry Bridges, and there was a secretary-treasurer who was very well thought of. His name was Lou Goldblatt, and Lou Goldblatt was the secretary of the union in San Francisco, well, for the entire union, which is the union itself is in Western Canada, Washington, Oregon, California, Alaska, and Hawaii. And so the international officers have that entire district it belongs to the ILWU, and I got elected as the internet when Harry Bridges retired. A fellow from San Francisco, good friend of mine, his name was Jim Herman. He became the president following Harry Bridges, and the vice president for Harry Bridges was a black man by the name of Bill Chester. Jimmy Herman was the one that replaced Harry Bridges, and I replaced Bill Chester. Lou Goldblatt was an international secretary-treasurer. He was governed by the 2-year rule also. When his term or 2 years were up, along with Harry Bridges and Bill Chester, Lou Goldblatt left office, and friend Curtis McLean, a black fellow from San Francisco, who was the president of the Watchmen's he led the warehouse unions, the warehouse locals, the ILW warehouse locals, and he got elected as secretary-treasurer to replace Curtis McLean got elected. He was the black man that replaced Lou Goldblatt as secretary-treasurer, and then we stayed in office for, I think I stayed in office for 11 years. And then I quit running for office. I stayed longshoring and worked another 15 or 20 years as a longshoreman here in I worked in every port up. We used to get travel card, and so I started with traveling. My purpose of traveling was because I wanted to get elected as a coastwise vice president, and I figured if I worked in all the locals, I would be known to the membership of those locals. So I started in Seattle, Washington, and worked my way down, working in every port: Portland, Oregon, San Francisco, and San Pedro, Wilmington. So I was able to get to know a lot of the people, and that helped me to get elected as an international officer, when before that there was the 2-year rule. My message to the younger people now, it's changed a lot, because you can be a pensioner and stay there, or you can travel up and down the coast and work as a longshoreman or whatever, warehouseman, whatever industry you came out of. And of course, there's females. I was the president of Local 13 when the first female longshore person was hired here in San Pedro. Well, actually, it was for the whole coast. Her name was Billy Padilla. I think she's deceased now. And Billy Padilla was the first female longshore worker that was registered in Local 13, and then throughout the West Coast. And we were very proud of that. And I think that if you're a young man and you're longshoring, or you're starting your career, or you've been here for a few years, you're very fortunate. Nobody has ever quit longshoring that I'm aware of. Once a longshoreman, always a longshoreman, but things expanded, and you were able to travel and work in different ports. Before they had that, I traveled up to Seattle, and I came south from Seattle to Tacoma. I don't know if that might be a little east, but I worked in every port that was available till I ended up in San Diego. So I worked in every port on the West Coast before I retired. And it was an honor, because a lot of the people remembered me or would know my name, having been an officer, and it was just a great honor. I think my father was the proudest of anybody I've ever seen when I became the president of the Longshore Union. Anyway, good luck to all you young fellows that are starting, or even if you're not young, you're starting, and good luck to you, and keep the ILWU going for many, many years, and the females too.